Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so glad to welcome you as part of our community tonight. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and distributed live stream. By entering this virtual meeting room, you give your consent to be recorded and distributed by Simeon Morrow Public Speaking and Presentations, Vienna Live with Simeon Morrow, and other third parties. If you prefer to not be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone and/or go to the Facebook Live video feed, the link to which I'll now place in the chat room. For a better experience, please turn off your microphone and set your video to gallery view. This show thrives on participant contributions, and all participants are encouraged to actively participate in this webinar by asking questions and making comments. To do so, please either write in the chat room, raise your hand, or turn on your microphone, say hi, and I'll be delighted to include your perspective in the conversation. Tonight, our featured guests are Gino Cattani, Professor of Management and Organizations at New York University, and Simone Ferriani, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Bologna and the City University of London. Gino, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening.
Gino, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into so-called management science?
It was an easy decision for me because I wanted to be an academic ever since I was in high school. Then I realized that becoming a professor of history was a very tough career trajectory, so I decided to compromise a little bit, and study business and economics. And so still interested in more from a managerial, and also thanks to my collaboration with Simone, the passion for history has become a central part of my research. So many of our studies are not only longitudinal, but also case.
Okay. Gino, can you hear me?
As I said, yes, I can hear very well. But as I said, I've been always interested in being an academic, so it was a very smooth transition from high school to university, and then after graduating to be on the other side of the university, becoming myself a professor.
Fantastic. Simone, welcome.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, share a little bit of my experience with Gino doing research. So my entry into the world of academia was more of a serendipitous type of entry, in the sense that it wasn't intended to be. I had never thought about the possibility of becoming an academic. In fact, I was doing completely unrelated things at the time, right after my MSc. I was very much interested in making it into the world of film industry. And so for a short period of time, I basically established with a group of friends a little production company, writing and directing short movies, advertisement. I was myself a director, a writer, an actor. For a few years, I also worked with a drama group, performing classic Shakespearean material on stage. But then somehow I was intrigued by at the time was the supervisor who was taking care of my MSc dissertation, by his proposal to at least explore the bizarre idea of doing research on the film industry rather than being involved more as a practitioner. And so I basically started a little project on dynamics of collaboration in the film industry. And that project eventually turned out to become much more than just a little project. It became a full-fledged paper. It was eventually published in a journal. And more importantly, that little project also hooked me, in the sense that it showed me the potential and the opportunities of being an academic. And so in a way, also being a boundary spanner, I think what academics are at the end of the day are potentially boundary spanner in the sense that they can explore very different domains. They can intellectually be engaged, but if they want, they can also be engaged more practically. And so basically, slowly but surely, I entered more and more into the academia as a result of this interaction with my supervisor at the time. But definitely it was very serendipitous. It was not planned.
So Simone, just to be clear about what that means exactly when you say you were becoming more an academic as opposed to a filmmaker actor. So when you're a filmmaker actor, then you are planning, producing, making films, writing scripts, acting them, learning the parts. As an academic, is it right to say then you are kind of taking into account the whole of, you're kind of looking at the whole film industry at a distance and kind of explaining, observing what's going on and seeing how it works from your point of view. Is that right? Or please correct me.
Yeah, I think there are two perspectives to this, to address your question. One is exactly as you were summarizing. It's an opportunity as an academic to take a kind of an helicopter view of the industry and basically reflecting on what's going on from an intellectual point of view and basically getting engaged with the protagonist of this industry, but more as an observer, trying to make sense of what they do and potentially offer them valuable insights that can inform their own practice. And so I've been conducting several studies with Gino, of course, on the film industry, analyzing film industry data and basically deriving we believe are interesting insights on things that happen in this industry and that can definitely help professionals and practitioners, better understand, shed light on some of the dynamics that perhaps being involved in the day-to-day, you don't really have an opportunity to appreciate to the same extent that someone who is more detached can do. So intellectually, you're absolutely right. Looking at the industry, analyzing data, talking to these people with the aspiration of generating some kind of insights that can be of value for the industry. But on the other hand, I think it's not too different in a way to be, a professional in the industry and to be an academic, because if you think about it, when you are an academic, there is a very strong creative component because you have to come up with research ideas and you have to come up with strategies on how to, go about, exploring those ideas, those research questions. So there is a lot of creativity that goes into that, of course, and a lot of planning. But also there is a very strong performing part because as an academic, you are always on the stage, right? You have to try to deliver your ideas in a way that are accessible to an audience of students, of MBAs or executives. And when you are teaching, you are basically on the spotlight all the time. And sometimes you even have some kind of a red thread of a script that you have to follow in order to make sure that your idea, get through as clearly, as compellingly, and as eloquently as possible. So there is this performing component, there is the design component, the creativity thing. So it's at the end of the day, in a completely different manner, but there are many commonalities between being, an artist in the film industry, a director or a performer or an actor in my case, and being an academic. There are quite a few commonalities, and both careers, I would say, are highly entrepreneurial.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Wonderful. How inspiring. Gino, I want to go back to you because your internet cut out a little bit. Can you just tell us again? So you were always interested in becoming an academic. You started in history. And then
my dream was to study business history at university, but then I soon realized that becoming a business historian was not probably the easiest career trajectory. So I preferred to study economics, and that still gave me the opportunity to study economics, but obviously more from a management standpoint. Then, of course, in my research, this passion for history will remain there. And much of my research is historical in perspective, where there's a longitudinal case study. We will talk about some of them today, but or whether it's like a large sample study, but it's always over time. So basically, the idea that we have to study a phenomenon, a complex social phenomenon, diachronically over time, how it evolves over time, has been has remained there. So I think in many ways, some of my early dreams are now slowly coming true. Yeah.
Fantastic. And tell us, is it, can you say the same thing as Simone, that you've really found your place, that you were searching for something, and now more or less, now you have become then this business historian that you once desired to become, or you've become something completely different, or you're working? I mean,
well, I think that I think it's more of a slow evolutionary process. I mean, I think I don't consider myself a business historian, although I like taking an historical perspective in studying certain phenomena. I mean, but I think that clearly that is part of what I am, and I'm glad that over the years, I mean, I've been able to do that, even sometimes against the recommendations or the wise suggestions of other colleagues. But at some point you have to do what you like, and if you do it well, sooner or later you will be rewarded, correct? And so that is clearly for me the most important thing. And of course with Simone and others, but Simone is my main co-author. I mean, we have been pursuing this venue over the past few years, and I think we have been rewarded for that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, let's take a look then. Simone, maybe let's start or go right into this. So the first topic we will discuss is, where do great innovations come from? Tell us a little bit about this so-called paradox of marginality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have prepared a few slides to illustrate this paradox. So let me please share the screen, and then we can move forward. So let me see if I can share it, and right here, and I go full screen now. That should be it. Okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. So this paradox of marginality really has been center stage throughout our research in the last probably I would say almost 15 years. And we like to think about this problem as a paradox, or as some kind of conundrum or tension. And I'm going to explain you the reason in a second. Essentially, the point of departure for this is just think about, great innovation, radical innovation. And it is often the case that those innovation that really have the potential to subvert established order of a market or an industry, well, those innovations are often pushed forward, promoted by individuals who are located at the margins of that market or that field, sometimes even outside of it. So to illustrate the point, a very interesting case is the case of Catalin Kariko. The case of Catalin Kariko, you might be aware that Catalin Kariko in a way defied all odds to pioneer the mRNA technology that eventually gave the world the very first COVID vaccine in record time. Well, the story of Catalin Kariko is reflective of many of the trajectory that we've been discovering over the years. She was definitely a marginal figure in the field. She was a daughter of a butcher. She was raised in a small adobe house in a former Eastern Bloc with no running water, no refrigerator. And she started working on RNA in Hungary as a student. And shortly afterwards, she moved in the United States to pursue her dream of becoming a researcher. She was in her late 20s when she decided to move in the United States. But essentially what happened is that for several decades, she faced rejection after rejection, even the scorn of colleagues who basically did not believe in her intuition and in the potential of her ideas. She even had to face the threat of deportation when she was in the United States. Now, today, Kariko is, and her work is foundational, is really, a pillar, cornerstone for all the work that has been done on mRNA, and is at the heart of vaccines developed by BioNTech, but also by Moderna. And many researchers have even called for Kariko to win the Nobel Prize. So basically, our studies suggest that successes like Kariko, they do not occur just despite the status of being a marginal or a peripheral or an outsider, but because of it. That's the most interesting part, and that's probably where the paradox comes from. And I will elaborate on this in a second, but first I want to say a few more words on the origin of these advantages that sometimes go unnoticed when you are at the margin, but there are quite a few advantages that can be leveraged. And so, for instance, typically people at the margin have what the great sociologist Robert Merrill called focused naivete. They have this useful ignorance of prevailing assumption that sometimes enables these people to attack problems that are generally regarded as irrelevant or even impossible to solve. Being at the margin, you also have typically exposure to different type of stimuli, fresh ideas, things that have not yet been digested by the system. You also quite commonly have stronger motivation than the average, exactly because you are marginalized, because you are peripheral. Your desire, your drive to make an entry into a particular field, a particular world, becomes really fuel, powerful fuel to keep these people pushing and pushing. And also because you are not embedded in the system, you're marginal to the system, or you are less tied to the canons, the standards, the norms to which the people inside the system actually have to conform. And so because you are not so imbued with these dominant norms, you can recognize solutions that can escape the attention of the incumbents. So all these things really help to understand why these marginal actors sometimes really have potential advantages. However, there is a great paradox in here. And the paradox, you might have already, figured that out by yourself. But the paradox is that that same position, that same marginal position that gives you an advantage when you are a peripheral, also in the sense that you can come up with more imaginative progress, less constrained, all the things that I said, also represent actually a big burden, because being marginal means that you typically are cut out from the sources of support that are in the system. You have no ties to the insider or very limited ties. You have no recognition. You have no markers of credibility if you are a genuine outsiders. And so this is really the essence of this, what we call the conundrum or the paradox, right? You, on the one hand, you may be facilitated in coming up with truly fundamentally new things, but at the same time, you are impeded, you are blocked by the lack of all those other things that are important to create legitimacy around your ideas. So the big question then is, how do the innovations of peripherals like Kariko gain traction? How do they make an impact? How do outsiders make an entry into the world that they have targeted? So we have spent a large part of our research time thinking about this question, exploring it with a variety of techniques, qualitative techniques, quantitative techniques, large data set analysis, experiments. I will talk a little bit about our experiments later on, but also extensively using, as Gino was alluding, historical method and historical case studies, including research on several iconic innovators. For instance, John Harrison, whom you will hear about in a moment. Gino will talk about him, Coco Chanel, Steve Jobs, and Quentin Tarantino. Today, we will focus particularly on the first two, John Harrison and Coco Chanel, because those are the two that we've been investigating probably more thoroughly, more systematically. And the way in which we want to introduce you to these two cases is by showing you one video. The video will take us face to face with a problem of 18th century problem, which was basically permeating the whole of Europe. And the problem was about how to measure longitude at sea. This was a very dramatic issue at the time, because by not being able to measure the longitude, very often you ended up with a whole fleet of ships clashing against the coastline. Okay, so let me show you the video, and then I will hand it over to Gino, who will go deeper into, how John Harrison tackled this great problem. So let's see if you can hear and properly see the video. Let me start it. There you go.
Yep.
Okay.
In 1714, the British government offered rewards of up to £20,000, millions today, to anyone who could accurately find longitude at sea. Up till then, ships had struggled to accurately plot their position, meaning voyages could take far longer than expected. They knew their latitude, their position from north to south, from the location of the sun, but could only estimate their longitude, their position from east to west. So a group of experts, later called the Board of Longitude, was created to judge and reward inventors and inventions that could measure longitude. Open to the public, some were simply not feasible.
This is not deserving of the board's attention.
But two methods succeeded. Both tried to measure time at the ship and at a known reference point, one by astronomical means, the other using clocks. Mathematicians and astronomers charted the moon's position and predicted its future movements, eventually creating a nautical almanac that allowed vessels to accurately plot their longitude. Meanwhile, John Harrison worked to create a more accurate timekeeper. Clocks hadn't been reliable enough until then, but after 30 years of working with the board, Harrison made a watch that could help find longitude at sea. The board documented their progress towards this and their other work, creating a vast archive. The papers record scientific endeavour, pioneering exploration, fateful voyages, and lifetimes of commitment to a common cause.
Okay. Now, Gino, over to you. It's time to introduce the protagonist, John Harrison.
Okay, thanks, Simone. I think the video is interesting, not so much because of the solution itself, but because it basically introduces this incredible figure, John Harrison, who was the person, as many of you, I'm sure, know already, solved the longitude problem. John Harrison was an interesting person because he was truly an outsider, a marginal player. He had no formal education. He was actually a carpenter who was passionate about horology. He used to like building clocks himself during the spare time. And he got interested in the longitude problem because he thought that a clock, a timekeeper, could be the best way to resolve this conundrum, this puzzle that not even the best astronomers and mathematicians of the time could effectively resolve. It's important to say that at that time, John Harrison was stimulated to basically compete for this major award that was instituted and was supposed to be awarded to anybody who could solve the longitude problem, because the Longitude Act in 1714 essentially said that anybody who had an idea about how to solve this issue was entitled to submit a proposal to the Board of Longitude, and the Board of Longitude eventually would have adjudicated which solution was the best, and therefore award the prize that was created by the British Parliament. If we go to the next slide, it's interesting to show the complex journey that John Harrison had to go through in order to get his idea, the timekeeper, accepted. It was a process that lasted for more than 30 years. And you can see from this slide how this journey was not a linear process, was a journey punctuated by twists and turns, was a bumpy journey in which Harrison, starting as an outsider, got closer to the center of the field to which he was trying to contribute, essentially the astronomy, but not using the astronomical approach, using a completely different mechanical approach that mathematicians and astronomers were kind of resisting, if not opposing altogether. The slide shows how over time, also thanks to the help of sympathetic audiences, including the Royal Society, that was a very interesting association embracing anybody, any inventor, not necessarily academic, but anybody who had interesting ideas, who could solve interesting problems. So the Royal Society was, by its very nature, very receptive of novelty, regardless who was the originator of this novelty. There was no a priori bias against people who were not academics. So that clearly was an important initial boost, endorsement for John Harrison, who had no credentials, no, as I said, standing in the academic environment. And over time, obviously, the position of the Board of Longitude, that was an heterogeneous audience, including mathematicians and academics and astronomers, including the representative of the government, politicians, in other words, and also representative of the Navy that had a strong interest, obviously, in the solution of the longitude issue. The Board of Longitude, I was saying, was sometimes more positively disposed towards the solution that John Harrison was proposing, sometimes more skeptical, more resistant. And that actually occurred when the astronomers and the mathematicians got increasingly confident that the solution could come from the astronomical approach, thanks to some important mathematical advancements that over the years have been achieved that allowed mathematicians and astronomers to calculate, compute the position of to essentially define the lunar manual, basically the position of compute the position of the moon almost to the minute over the entire year. So essentially, this process that, as I said, was pretty bumpy, it was not a linear process, came to an end in favor of John Harrison when, in addition to the support of the Royal Society and the support of the Navy, that got increasingly confident that the timekeeper was indeed the best solution, definitely the simpler solution between the two. Also, you got the support of the king. And the king was, at that time, was actually, as a hobby, he was a neurologist himself. So he had a strong interest in neurology, and therefore he was very interested in the solution that John Harrison was suggesting. Not to mention that John Harrison, over the years, became, in England, truly a celebrity because his clocks were truly a wonder for the time. And they could actually, the precision of these clocks was astonishing, even when they were used for transoceanic voyages. And of course, he also received the support of other people like James Short. He was himself a scientist, and he was also a ghost writer for John Harrison. I will elaborate on this later, but the important point here is that John Harrison, in addition to his agentic efforts, also rely on the support endorsement over here of sympathetic audiences like the King, Royal Society, James Short, early on even Edmund Halley, who was himself a very open-minded academic, without which it would have been very difficult for him to resist for more than 30 years trying to push through his ideas, the timekeeper. So based on this in-depth case analysis, Simone and I and another co-author, Andrea Lanza, who actually came up with this dialectical process model that, in our opinion, captures the essence of many journeys through which novelty, especially radical innovation, become accepted and recognized in a particular field, not just in this particular case, but also in other cases. And the three building blocks, if you wish, here are obviously the agent, the innovator, who basically tried to push through his ideas or her ideas through a variety of tactics and strategies, which I will describe briefly later in the presentation, but also the role of important audiences or constituencies, if you wish, who are more or less sympathetic, more or less willing to endorse and support this radical novelty. And the idea here is that the agent, the innovator, has to really appeal to this audience and audiences and trying to persuade them, again, through a variety of tactics and strategies that can increase the chance of gaining the attention, but also the support, material and symbolic, from these audiences. The other building block is the role of these jolts or shocks. In other words, events that are outside the control of the innovator that might make any field more permeable, more receptive. I mean, clearly the shipwreck in 1707 that the video was referring to was an important event because catalyzed the attention of the British Parliament, the Navy, the scientific community, and basically there was almost unanimous consensus that something had to be done in order to resolve the longitude issue. And anybody at this point could contribute. Without this shock, with this exogenous shock, probably the field would have been much less receptive towards solutions coming from people like John Harrison, who had no credentials. And probably the only people entitled to come up with the right solution would have been astronomers and mathematicians, correct? And so these events that could be macro shocks or localized shocks sometimes are really lowering the entry barriers to innovators, especially those like who are at the margins or full-blown outsiders like John Harris. Next slide, Simone. I think probably. Okay, so this process model, as I was saying, is not just useful to understand the journey of John Harrison, but as I anticipated, could be also useful to study other journeys, like the journey of Coco Chanel, of which Simone will tell you about more.
Yes, thank you, Gino. So Coco Chanel is another wonderful, paradigmatic, quintessential case of an outsider making an amazing entry into a world and a field that was at the beginning of the journey very far away from the initial position of the outsider. She was born in a small rural town where she was raised in conditions of extreme poverty. Her father was a traveling peddler. The mother was a laundress who died early. She was, I think, 10 or 12 when the mother died. And so basically the father had to abandon, he decided to abandon Chanel and all her sisters in an orphanage where she was raised by nuns. But it is precisely in this humble condition, this humble context, that if you look carefully, you see that all her most interesting and unusual ideas come from. She found inspiration for some of her most iconic design concepts at the margins, in that context. So, in fact, the pattern that we almost invariably always identify and observe, it's a pattern where the outsider innovate by acting on insights and experiences that are new to the context in which they enter, but familiar to the context they come from. So, going back to Coco Chanel, the example is really very strong. So Chanel, as I said, was raised in an orphanage, and for instance, her proverbial preference for black and white is generally attributed to her prolonged exposure to the colors of the orphanage uniforms and the nuns' tunics. White blouses, black skirts were the uniforms worn by the orphans. Even the distinctive logo, the Chanel logo, was an idea that she gleaned from a simple stained glass window of the orphanage at the Abbey of Aubazin. So, in other words, in those years that she spent in the outskirts of society, at the margin as kind of an outcast, she developed a unique aesthetic disposition, a unique angle that was essentially characterized by the primacy of simplicity and function over form, because that was she was raised essentially, and it was epitomized by this idea of clothes as uniforms. More generally, and that's the larger point that you should probably make, is that being at the margin of the empire allows these individuals the creative freedom to experiment with ideas that would otherwise probably have been repressed. Okay. The other thing about Chanel that again resonates very much with the story that Gino just summarized is that just like Harrison, she displayed this very strong ability to grow strategic connection, strategic ties with sympathetic audiences, sponsors, and influential members of the Parisian high society. At that time, her greatest sponsor was this woman depicted here in the slide, Misia Cerf, who was a famous, very influential patron of artists, who had a very central position among avant-garde artists in Paris. These artists gravitated to her salon around her. And through Misia, basically Chanel came in contact with this circle, with this collaborative circle of extraordinary intellectuals who essentially adopted Chanel. Why did they adopt Chanel? Because she shared with them this new modernist impetus. Okay? The emphasis on functionality, on simplicity, on geometry. She really leveraged this connection through Misia, building a social network that allowed her to push her vision, her aesthetic vision, her ideas much beyond her business into other domains, including, of course, theatrical performance through Cocteau, ballet through Diaghilev, but also film and other contexts. Then, of course, an interesting question is what kind of skills, what kind of competencies are needed in order to build and nurture this relationship with sympathetic audiences. And Gino was alluding at the importance of, developing some kind of persuasive skill, power of persuasion. And in fact, it is trying to address this question that we basically landed in a new research trajectory. Then we started to realize the importance of language and the importance of rhetorics, in developing this persuasion that eventually is crucial in nurturing this key relationship with sympathetic audiences. Gino was talking about tactics or strategies, rhetorical strategies. So going back to the John Harrison case, and our engagement was with John Harrison, it was exactly by studying John Harrison that we first realized and encountered the importance of this idea of looking at language, looking at rhetorics as a way for better understanding the ability of this actor to create and cultivate strategic relationship. So Gino, over to you to talk a little bit about these strategic rhetorical strategies.
Well, I'll be brief for the sake of time. Obviously these rhetorical strategies are part of a broader, if you wish, range of tactics and strategies that you can adopt. If you look at the story of John Harrison, he had to undertake over the years multiple test experiments, obviously some that he conducted himself to test and his clocks, but others that were actually mandatory. So that was a necessary condition to obviously gain the award. So some of these were, in other words, enforced by the Board of Longitude. So that was obviously critical. It's always critical, in other words, to show the mechanics of what you're doing, right? Something that even Harrison didn't fully understand is the importance of convincing the evaluative audience, especially astronomers and mathematicians, that the clocks work because there are some reasons why they work. So and then you have to show why they're working to enable others to reproduce what you're doing. The other thing, of course, is to enlist the support of sympathetic audiences and possibly also persuade skeptical audiences that what you're doing has some merit. So this has been an ongoing effort that John Harrison has been conducting over the years. He filed petition with the parliament, tried to persuade the parliament that the Board of Longitude sometimes was unnecessarily, unduly resistant to his offers, and there was a conflict of interest with Mascalin, who was the board was the president, essentially, that was chairing the board of longitude, at the same time competing with John Harrison, pushing or vouching for the astronomical approach to solving the longitude. But then, as Simone was referring to, he also understood the importance of using text-based narratives. Sometimes these pamphlets or these manuals that you put together to explain what he was doing and also to persuade the target audiences, in particular the board of longitude, were written by a ghost writer, someone who actually could speak and write good English. John Harrison had that shortcoming, not being obviously, he was not illiterate, but he was not highly educated, so he didn't know how to write well and also express himself properly. And so why is this important? Because part of the efforts that an innovator has to make is to persuade the target audience. And the narrative approach, the use of language, storytelling, the way you frame your ideas, you communicate your ideas is of crucial importance, especially when you address an audience that you are not that belongs to a field that is not your own field. So being able to speak, for instance, the language of mathematicians and astronomers, the academics, was crucial. So Simone will elaborate a little bit more on this in the next few slides. Yeah.
So essentially, to investigate, to go deeper into the role of language in shaping innovation or in facilitating or impeding this effort at innovation, we designed a new research project a few years ago, where the goal was basically to answer a simple question: what's the best way to communicate a new idea to maximize its impact? Or more precisely, how should innovators pitch their new ideas to win the support of the audiences they are targeting? And now, before taking you through the details of the project, probably I should use this example, which I think is very effective in helping understand where we were coming from. So I'm sure many people, most of you have at least once heard about the start with why idea, popularized by Simon Sinek in one of the most successful TED Talk ever, with I think 60 million views or something like that. Well, essentially, in that talk, and more extensively in a book that he eventually published, Start with Why, Sinek suggests that the most effective way for mobilizing people around an idea is to frame your message by emphasizing the why behind the message, the why of what we are trying to achieve. I'll get to the mechanics of this intuition in a moment, but essentially the point is that when you communicate an idea purpose, again, the why of the idea, it is easier for people to relate to that idea because it allows to appreciate the motivation, right, that drive the idea. This view by Simon Sinek, however, it's not univocal. It's not univocal because Wharton School professor, again a celebrity, Adam Grant, in another best-selling book, he takes a slightly different position. His point is that he basically argues that innovators who are trying to champion new ideas, they should be concrete. They should privilege a more concrete framing by spelling out the how of how they intend to implement their ideas. In that book, Adam Grant doesn't really provide empirical evidence to support this intuition, but essentially the point is that framing ideas around lofty purposes is more at risk of clashing with the notion of what is possible, their deep-seated belief. And so this gives rise to an interesting tension. It triggers potentially this conundrum, because on the one hand, you have the why view, pitch, framing your ideas, emphasizing the purpose. On the other hand, you have this how, pitch the ideas, focusing on the implementation. Two camps opening up a conundrum, which is exactly what has hooked in the first place, the existence of a conundrum. We always try to, also be inspired in our research by things that are not obvious, the things that are somehow paradoxical potentially, or they create some kind of contention. So the way we joined this conversation on language and innovation was by bringing attention to what at the time we saw was a missing piece in this debate. And the missing piece was the identity of the target audience. Of course, we were interested in the identity of the target audience because we were coming from all our research on John Harrison and Chanel that kept telling us, listen, it really makes a difference who you're talking to, right? Because different audiences have different inclination, dispositions, and so it's key to identify the right audience and tailor your message accordingly to the audience that you're targeting. So focusing on the audience, essentially the intuition we explored in this research was the importance of framing the message with an audience in mind to maximize the power of the message. And to explore the intuition, how to best frame your idea, having in front of you different type of audience. To explore this thing, we designed a set of experiments, lab experiments, that essentially involved asking two groups of audiences. By the way, this study was published in a scholarly journal, but then was also popularized with a shorter version on Harvard Business Review. Here you can see the cover of the article. When pitching an idea, should you focus on why or how? So to explore the intuition, as I was saying, we designed a set of experiments which involve two types of audience, two group of audiences. A group of novices, investment novices, people with no experience in support investing in ideas, and a group of venture capitalists, so highly experienced people whose job is exactly to evaluate and invest in ideas. So we presented these two groups with an entrepreneur's pitch, the pitch of a new idea. And then we examined whether the responses of these two groups to the idea they were presented with varied when the innovator framed the solution in terms of concrete action, so in terms of how the product or service satisfies specific goals, as opposed to framing exactly the same idea, exactly identical idea, only changing the framing, as opposed to a high-level purpose type of framing. So why the product or service is desirable. And what we found confirmed our expectation, basically suggesting that the answer to the how versus why question is basically, it depends. There's no silver bullet. There's no universal answer. As anticipated by Sinek, novices appreciated the idea more when it was framed in a more abstract, purpose-driven why type of framing, why terms. However, the experts appreciated the idea more when it was framed in concrete how terms, as Grant suggests. So in essence, so the reason why this happens is that, framing your idea with an emphasis on why help the novices appreciate the reasons behind and why it is desirable. And especially if they perceive it as useful, this is very important. This is what matters to someone who is a novice, who has no familiarity with evaluating ideas and in general with the world of, cutting edge technologies. Experts, on the other hand, are more likely to be responsive in a positive way to concrete arguments about how something can be done because they already understand the advantages what the advantages of the idea would be. Okay, so the purpose behind the idea. So choosing a why or how framing does make a significant difference in mobilizing support. But again, there is no univocal answer. Instead, there is a right framing for a right audience. We try to compress this experiment and this story in a short video. It's a 2-minute video that basically tells the entire story in a more engaging manner than I was able to convey. So let me share the video before then handing over again to Gino to introduce a follow-on topic. So there you go.
What is the most effective way to pitch a new idea? In one of the most popular TED Talks ever, Simon Sinek argues that the best way for mobilizing people and attention around an idea is to frame our message by emphasizing the why of what we're trying to achieve. Communicating an idea's purpose, according to Sinek, is key to win an audience's support because it allows it to understand the goals behind it. But is this truly the best way to hook your audience? Maybe not. In his best-selling book, world-renowned organizational psychologist Adam Grant counters that framing new ideas around lofty purpose is more likely to challenge deep-seated beliefs about what is possible. Hence, he argues, a concrete frame or how you plan to implement your idea should be preferred. So, why or how? To address this question, we designed and ran a series of experiments where an innovative idea is pitched to two different types of audiences: an expert group of professional investors and a non-expert group of lay evaluators. We then examined how they responded depending on whether the idea was framed in terms of concrete actions or high-level purposes. So, who's right? Is a why or a how-oriented framing more successful? It depends. A why frame works best with non-experts, increasing their chance to appreciate the idea by 25%. Conversely, emphasizing how the idea could be implemented is much more effective with experts, causing a 44% boost in their preference. It is little known that the founders of many iconic ventures such as Southwestern Airlines, Apple, and Airbnb were repeatedly turned down when originally pitching their venturing ideas to professional investors. Did they employ the wrong framing? Possibly. Our findings indicate that innovators have a much better chance of winning non-experts' attention if they emphasize the purposes and goals of their idea. But this approach is suboptimal when dealing with an audience of experts. To win expert support, you'd better signal them how you would concretely intend to achieve your goals. So, why or how? If you know your audience, you know the answer.
Okay, so what is next, Gino?
Okay, so let me introduce a couple of new topics. I will discuss about one in particular, and then Simone will discuss the other. But the new topic that has been as at the center of our recent research is the tension between tradition and innovation. This is a theme that is gaining traction in the management literature. It's an old theme, but recently there's been a renewed interest in this tension. The extent to which, in other words, tradition, and tradition is understood in a very broad sense, could be production process. Think about, for instance, craft production processes when it comes to musical instruments like Steinway, making pianos always relying to a large extent on craftsmanship. They could also be, like in the case, in the context that we are studying, traditional operas, how you stage traditional operas. Should you stage traditional operas the same way they were staged in the past, with maybe a few changes in terms of singers, other performers, and of course the orchestra? Or should you try to renovate or renew some of these opera in a particular way? So the tension here is to understand, can firms adhere to a particular tradition and at the same time to innovate? Or if you adhere to a particular tradition, you are essentially limiting your ability to innovate. And this tension is actually very important because, as I said, it's not only observed in a small range of cultural industries like opera or, for instance, theater, but it's actually a much broader issue that cuts across a variety of different industries. So in this paper that just came out, we really studied this tension in the context of the opera industry. And our goal is trying to understand how the simultaneously enabling and constraining effects of a revered tradition like opera can be reconciled. As I said, tradition can be seen as a resource that firms can leverage to increase their value creation potential and also capture this value, or it could be a constraint. What we show in the study is indeed a tradition that in the opera industry is an existing opera, so a traditional opera, can be perceived as a resource that opera houses can leverage and to some extent can also renew. One of the challenges that, for instance, opera houses face is to overcome the impression that opera houses are like museums that don't tolerate any change, and on the contrary, project the image of being firms, that organizations that try to renovate themselves, particularly through the kind of the opera that they stage and how they stage it. So what we indeed find out is that over the years, there's been an ongoing effort on the part of opera houses to reinterpret traditional operas. And this is actually another way of leveraging an existing resource, existing operas, but by introducing some novelty. This can be done in two fundamental ways. One is to situate an opera in a different time and space. So this is what we define changing some peripheral features of the opera, or what we call robust interpretation. In other words, in this case, you don't change the core feature of the opera, in other words, the music, the script, you only change the visual aspect, basically the spatial and temporal coordinates of the opera. You can see the contrast between the original version and the robust interpretation of Madama Butterfly by Giacomo Puccini. No change in the music, of course, no change in the script. The characterization of the protagonist is still the same, but the opera is placed in a different time and space. The other example, Il Ratto del Serraglio by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, is an example of a more radical type of reinterpretation, what we call indeed a radical interpretation, where not only are the visual aspects or features of the opera modified, but also the characterization of the protagonist is altered or modified. The music is never changed typically, but the script and the characterization of the opera, of the protagonist of the opera, sometimes is changed. So this is actually the extreme change, because obviously traditional viewers, people that have been exposed to the traditional way of representing operas, might feel sometimes uncomfortable about some of these changes. And indeed, what we found in this study is that, going back to the audience theme that cuts across our research in general, is that there are different reactions to different interpretations depending on the segments of the opera goers that we analyze. The more traditional conservative opera goers are the seasonal ticket holders, and while the single ticket holders tend to be, on average, much more receptive of radical interpretation. Seasonal ticket holders like innovation, but is innovation that is not radical, so they tend to prefer robust interpretations. Over time, just to emphasize the magnitude of the phenomenon, you can see how the percentage of operas that are either radical or robust interpretation over the entire operas being staged in a particular year has increased from just a small, tiny percentage to becoming almost 50% or more over the years. So this is actually the new project just published in SMJ. So for those who are interested, they can just download and read the paper. Simone, now next to you for the last topic.
Yeah, the final 3 minutes. I will talk a little bit about another stream of research that we started recently is on the role of style and aesthetics in strategy. On the topic, you can see the cover here of a book that we published together with two colleagues, Frédéric Godard from INSEAD and Stoyan Skurev from ESSEC. And basically, the premise for the book is quite simple, and it's the observation that companies, just like artists, can cultivate their style and make it manifest through, aesthetic pattern, recognizable aesthetic choices that shape products, services, practices, buildings, but also managerial principles. And it is precisely this stylistic consistency over time, for instance, that allows us to distinguish between a movie by Federico Fellini or a movie by Ingmar Bergman, between a Mogul garden or a Rogi garden, between Wright houses or Usonian houses, or even between the leadership style of, I don't know, Bill Gates as opposed to the leadership style of Steve Jobs. So the volume essentially examines these aesthetic choices that the company regularly make, deciding on the look of their products, the shape or colors of their logo, the design of their space, the dress code of their employees, the way in which aesthetic and stylistic principles inform the culture and the strategy of a company, ultimately making an impact on the bottom line, contributing to achieving success, possibly in the marketplace. So in the book, we edited the book with a collection of contribution from various scholars. We contributed in particular an introduction where we talk about the aesthetic turn in strategy, and this aesthetic turn is about connecting design and engineering, style and technology, and using aesthetic features to improve performance. And that's certainly a central component of the book. But it's also about infusing this aesthetic principle into organizational activities, not just into products. Organizational activities infused with a sense of beauty, trusting that, as Oscar Wilde reminds us, there cannot be real beauty without usefulness. Again, for the book, given the kind of unusual type of topic, we thought that it would lend itself nicely to video rendering. So we developed the script and produced a short video. Again, it's a 2 minutes video that basically summarizes the motivation behind the book, but also the key ideas of the book. So let me conclude by sharing this video.
Hey, Simone, look at this tiny device. Who would have thought we would get so hooked by it to the point of turning it into a fetish?
You're right, Gino. And you know where all these come from?
Tell me.
Well, let me take you back in time to 1972's Portland, Reed College. A then 18 years old Steve Jobs is taking calligraphy lessons.
Oh, Job was indeed obsessed with the aesthetic side of life.
Right. That same aesthetic sensitivity was put into use when creating the first Mac and imprinting one of the most famous consumer products of all time. It is such a great example of the role style and aesthetics play in the contemporary economy.
Style is everywhere nowadays. It influences how we perceive and evaluate products, services, and experiences. It drives the decision we make.
Exactly. The sensory experiences of products can evoke an association with elegance and motivate positive consumer reaction. It's not unusual for companies to devise aesthetic strategies to seduce consumers, like using design, referencing art, and so on. The point is that we often project our identities through the products we consume, wear, or carry.
Now that you mention it, I'm thinking about high heels.
High heels?
Sure, an iconic item made of ordinary materials once frowned upon, but has surged into a symbol of power, an object of desire. Once a privilege for the few, style is now available to everyone. And this process of physicization today extends from Persian bistros to Italian leather goods and Silicon Valley technological marvels.
Ooh la la! Magnifique, Frédéric. This is precisely what we're going to discuss in this volume. With the help of a number of prominent scholars, we'll analyze the implications of the process of aestheticization for market competition, consumption habits, and social identities. We'll learn how companies can use style to create a competitive advantage, and we'll discuss the relevance of style and beauty to the contemporary economy.
Thanks, Stoyan. It's an impressive volume. It embodies our conviction that style is a fundamental cultural element that connects our history, present, and future.
You are welcome to join our conversation.
In style and with style.
And as you might have figured out by yourself, the protagonist of the video, it's the 4 authors of the volume, Gino, myself, Stoyan, and Frederick. With that said, we are done with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. Thank you so much, Gino. And if I may say, your videos are fantastic, wonderful. And you are both great actors in the video. So
thank you. Thank you. You have a future.
Absolutely. So, so let's see how we can stay in touch with Simone and Gino. Here is Gino's website. It is the New York University Stern School of Management. There it is, his personal website and his email. So Gino, people can reach out to you through
Yes, anytime. I think that the best way would be to reach out through email. I typically respond quickly, so love to hear from anybody, any question or anything that you want to discuss. I'm more than happy to do it. Yeah.
Fantastic. So let me put that in the chat room. There it is. There is Gino's website, how you can reach out to him. And let's go to Simone's website. There it is. It is Bologna Business School. And we have his email contact right there. And people can reach out to you by clicking there, Simone?
Yes, I actually have two websites because I have two affiliations. The one at City University and the one in Bologna, but you can reach me either with that one or the one at City. I'm not entirely sure that email is the updated one. So in case it is not, you can just use the second one at City, because I actually have multiple affiliation, because I'm affiliated with the University of Bologna, but the University of Bologna has Bologna Business School where I also teach. So basically,
yes. Yeah, the second email, no, at the bottom here, Simone.
Yes, yeah. Here you can see both emails. That's perfect.
Yeah,
that's
perfect. Yeah.
And that's the easiest. That's the easiest way for reaching me, is to use the email. Definitely.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So please feel free to reach out to Gino and Simone with your questions and comments, and also offers to appear in new films. Fantastic. So thank you so very much to Professor.
You're welcome.
Gino Cattani and Professor.
Thank you so much.
Simone Ferriani.
Thanks for the opportunity.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure. Yes.
So let's
thanks for the. Let's go ahead.
Let's have a look at next Wednesday. We have coming up Mark Martorana, Education in Motion, Reimagined Learning Spaces. Metal desks and chairs, white concrete block walls, loud bells announcing the end of the quote-unquote learning period. Has the classroom based on the last century's industrial education model lost its charm? Mark Martorana, a New York City teacher, has adopted an alternative approach with his so-called consulting firm Walk and Talk Learning. Mark is providing tutoring access across academic subjects in outdoor settings, utilizing movement, philosophical conversation, and mindfulness-based practices. Rather than sitting still, encumbered by a heavy desk and chair, his students are walking during class. That freedom of motion creates the alert mental state that learning thrives in, challenging commonly held assumptions that New York City is bereft of natural spaces. Mark is making use of Central Park, especially the Strawberry Fields and North Woods. Come welcome Mark to our show for a discussion on the incorporation of movement and nature into learning. As always, all information about upcoming shows may be found at www.simeonmoro.com. Again, that's next Wednesday, Mark Martorana, Education in Motion, Reimagined Learning Spaces. Once again, thank you so much to Gino Cattani and Simone Ferriani. Thank you to Agnieszka and Benoit Rivole for their support of this show. Most of all, thanks to you, our participants, who make it all worthwhile. From London, England, New London, New Hampshire, and New York City, New York, goodbye, and see you next time.
Goodbye. Bye-bye. See you next time.
Bye. See you next time.